right, well, we're going to get started. Thanks for logging on. If this is your first time here, I'm Doug the Bee Guy. This is the Doug the Bee Guy channel. Welcome to the live stream. Today we're going to be talking about record keeping and beekeeping. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, that would be great. If you want to be a better beekeeper, please subscribe. Please like this video so that other people will be interested in looking at it. The more likes we get, the more distribution I get from YouTube, and that really helps the channel. Be sure to click on the notification bell if you subscribe so that you get notified when we put up new videos. That's important so that you don't miss anything. And just like to say that we monetized our channel today. YouTube approved us for that. We're pretty excited about that. We can have super chat. We're going to have commercials on our videos, and so hopefully that will help us bring more content to you in the future. And that's a pretty big deal for us. We've been working really hard for the last year to put up content. So with all that said, I think we'll get started. Remember, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. You can also come back to this video after I post it and put comments or questions in the comment area, and I'll get back to you with information. So why should we keep records in the first place about beekeeping? Why don't you just have beehives and let them sit there? And you could do that, and that's fine. If you're just a hobbyist and you have 1 or 2 beehives and you don't really care what's going on, that's great. But if you want to learn more, and if you want to remember maybe how your hives looked in the fall, you should keep records, because you'll forget important details like, was my cluster big? Was it small? Were my bees doing really well? And come spring when you're looking at the bees, you'll be like, well, I don't really remember what they look like. And so you might not remember that they were a cluster the size of a softball, and there wasn't really anything you could have done to overwinter a beehive that small. And those are the things that you don't know when you're a new beekeeper. There's things that no matter what you do, those bees are not going to make it. So you just you look at them in the fall and go, well, I know that those aren't going to make it. But until you have the information in your notes or experience, years under your belt, you're not going to know that, and you'll beat yourself up. This way, if you look in there and you go, okay, that's the size of a baseball, I know that cluster's not going to make it. So instead of having 5 hives survive, I know I'm going to have 4, hopefully. So those are the kind of things that record keeping will help you do. It also increases your learning and understanding of what's going on. Because if you keep track every year, over the years, you'll eventually start seeing patterns. Maybe the bees in your area need to be fed more and they're starving, or maybe whatever the case may be, there'll be something that'll show up as a pattern, something that you're not doing, and you'll be like, oh, yeah, 3 of my hives over the last 3 years have had the same problem. They came out of winter with a small cluster. Why is that? So those are the kind of things that record keeping will help you do. Talk to most beekeepers that have been doing this a long time. They'll have records going all the way back to probably when they started. I have a notebook that shows my very first hive in 2009, and it has probably 4 or 5 years in that. And then I moved on to some other things, which we'll talk about, some other different ways of keeping records. But those are I would say, the 2 big reasons of why you should do it. And, it's fun. It's fun to look back over the years and see, how you've grown and how many hives you've got, and maybe you're doing something differently now, different size hive, different kind of hives. And it's just interesting to look back, maybe show your kids or your grandkids or your siblings, what you've been doing over the years. And it's kind of cool to have a notebook to look through. All right. So we know that we want to keep records, but what should we keep records of? That's kind of important to think about. So when I first started, I didn't know anything about plants or when things bloomed. I was just cruising through life, doing my thing, working, and totally different industry than bees. And I didn't pay attention to when things bloomed. But my wife is kind of like a hobby botanist, and she's known the plant names in Latin and all that stuff since she was very little. And so she started teaching me when I got into the bees and started looking at all these books and wanted to figure out when things bloomed and what was blooming, what was dying, and what had nectar and what had pollen. She was the one who kind of helped me keep track of things. So that's one of the things that you should keep track of, is like what plant cycles are in the part of the world that you live in, the dates that things bloom, and what's blooming at a certain time and what's dying at a certain time. So, after I've done this for 10 years now, I know that like the first pollen that we get in this part of the country, hi Joanna, one of the first pollens that we get in this part of the world is maple. And then we get a little willow. And then around that same time, we have thousands of crocuses on our property that bloom, and these little snow flowers. And that's the first pollen that comes out in this part of the country in March. And so wherever you're at in the world or the country, you should find out what those first things are, and when they bloom, what they're called, and keep track of them for the next couple of years. Every time that you have a new season, just write it in your notebook. Maple bloomed March 31st. And then the next year, maple bloomed April 15th. And the next year, maple bloomed March 15th. So you'll kind of get a pattern, and you'll see that those bloom dates and seasons move. They move between 2 and 3 weeks, depending on where you're at in the world and the weather changes. So you can prepare your hive when you feed, when you do splits, swarming, all of those things that you'll learn about in beekeeping depend on what's blooming and what's going on in the world as far as nature. And it does change. It's not to the day every day. Every year it's a little different. Sometimes it's early, sometimes it's late. It just depends. So I started keeping track of the plant cycles, and I learned a lot about what blooms, what the bees eat, what they don't eat. And that has really helped me in my beekeeping. It's also helped me communicate with my wife, because now we're both interested in plants and what's going on, and it's kind of fun to learn about new plants. There's also a great app, which I don't know the name of, but you can find it on your phone, and you can actually take a picture of a plant, and it will send back to you what the plant is and what it's doing and where it's from in the world. So it's a pretty cool app. And if you look on your phone, you'll find it. There's actually, I think there's 2 or 3 of them, but it's really cool. You can use your phone for something besides a boat anchor and get some information. Joanna says it's called Plant Snap. So let's check that one out and see. Maybe that's one of them. All right. Let's see. What do we got next? We are going on to what else should we keep records of? And obviously, we want to keep records of our bees, not just what blooms and when it blooms and what's bringing in pollen, but we want to keep records of the actual bees. So what are some of the things that you would like to keep a record of? Well, obviously the number of hives you have, because most people that get into beekeeping start out with 1 or 2, and they have 3 or 4, and then they have 5, and then they have 20, and then they have to sell some. It's kind of an addicting hobby, and so that's what happens. Some people move into more commercial, and some people sell them to their friends, and a lot of people just, it grows over time. It's not necessarily something that you'll get out of. So you should keep track of the number of hives. You should keep track of your queens, because genetics are important. So it's kind of an in-depth topic. We're not going to get into it, but I have 4 or 5 different strains of bees that I raise, and I breed from each one of those every year. Try to keep my apiary with a balance of different kinds of bees. There's 4 or 5 main breeds. There's the Carniolans, the Italians, the Cordovans, and then there's hybrids, which are the Italian Carniolan mix, and then there's several other ones, VSH, which is the one that they're trying to breed that's resistant to mites, and there's quite a few breeds out there, but that's what I would keep track of. Track it over the whole season, or I'll show you some pictures a little later of what I do. I usually track it early in the spring, and then I get too busy in the summer, and I don't do my due diligence. I got too busy with my other job, and then I start tracking it in the fall again. And so I have a snapshot of at least at the beginning of the summer and at the end of the fall of how this hive did, so that I can decide whether I want to feed it, split it, maybe it swarmed, whatever happened to it. At least I kind of have a picture of it. If you're better at it than I am, just keep track of it. Look at it every couple of weeks and take notes. See how many frames of bees there are. You can open it up, see how much brood is in it, and just make notes about your hive and how it's going. That's important for determining what to do with it, like next year or the year after, or if there's any problems with it. The more you do that, the more you'll get used to what a hive should look like. I think it was about my third or fourth year when I started using a program called Hive Tracks, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I'm keeping track of my bee, what do you call it? When I go inside the hive, my bee inspections. And so in that year was the best year for me for inspections. I had more time for whatever reason, and I did 297 individual bee inspections with notes. And so that was the year that I actually learned, when I looked at a frame, of what the bees were doing, whether it was healthy, whether there was something wrong with it, what the brood pattern should be. And I learned different things about different kinds of bees, and it was very important. It kind of changed the way I kept bees, because that's what you need to do. You need to see it a lot, a lot, a lot. If you just look at your bees like once every 3 months, what are you going to learn? You're going to learn, okay, the bees are still alive or they're not alive, but you need to look at them a lot to see the difference, see the changes over the season. And that's when I started realizing that the different breeds of bees, some of them bring more pollen, some of them don't bring as much pollen. At that point is when I could start to predict what kind of a bee was going to survive in the part of the country that I live in, because I could just look at how much food they were bringing in and go, something wrong with this hive. They're not bringing in the right amount of food at this time, and they're not going to survive. And sure enough, I could start to predict by just looking at it. And that's what you need to do. You need to be able to get to that point. So looking at them, judging their strength is important. Feeding. The other thing you want to do is be looking at them so that you know when to feed. So that's the other, and keep track of when you fed them. You could write that down. So like this year, I fed all of my bees at least 3 patties this fall, and probably 2 or 3 in the spring. So this is the first year that I've done that. I used to feed them just in the spring. Now I'm feeding them more in the fall also. And so I've got that in my notes. I know which hives got how much food, and it makes a big difference. So when I go in the spring, I'll be able to look at them and see if they're stronger, see if it made a difference, decide if I want to spend the money again, and I'll have that in my notes. So the next year I can go, well, do I want to spend the money or not? So you can make those decisions based on your notes. All right, so next, the other thing that you should keep records of is obviously your honey crop. If you want a honey crop, if you're not interested in honey and you're just keeping bees for the fun of it, then that's fine. But if you want a honey crop, I would suggest keeping some notes about your honey. Keep notes of like what type of honey you get and when it's harvested. Where I'm at in the United States, I get 3 different kinds of honey. I get a light, a medium, and a dark, and they're from different plants. And I actually harvest them 3 times a year because we sell to a lot of people that have allergies. That's kind of our main customer. So we actually separate the honey out, and we get 3 different kinds. You can do that in a lot of places in the world, but you have to actually go into the hive and look and find the honey when it's ripe and get it out. Now, I don't get full supers at all those times in the year. In the spring, I only get 3 or 4 frames per hive, but that's enough because I get that light spring honey for people that have those early spring allergies from the tree pollen and the early flowers. It's a totally different honey than the dark stuff that we have in the fall, which is almost, you can't even see through it. It's so dark, from the goldenrod and the asters and all the what's the other one that we have? I can't think of it. Sumac, and that's the one that makes it really dark and chestnut colored. So that's important to keep track of what type of honey you get, how much you get, so that you can kind of understand what's going on in your part of the world. That also goes back with the plant cycles and the dates for what blooms and when it blooms. There's a chart. You can go to the USDA if you're from the United States. There's a bunch of charts, and go to the USDA.org site. I was just there a few minutes ago. And they tell you about how much honey different states produce. There's charts on like how much honey you should get, like average. So let's say you're in a part of the country where you can get 70 or 80 pounds per hive. You'll know that information by looking at it. Or maybe you're in a part of the country that's more desert and you don't get as much. So that information is definitely out there. They've been keeping that information for probably 100 years. So it's out there. So check that out as far as quantity of honey before you start getting excited about having thousands of beehives and you find out you live somewhere where you're not going to get a lot of honey. You might want to rethink that or put your bees somewhere else. The other thing you want to learn about in your notes is how much honey you should leave for the bees, because that's important. When you're first starting out, you'll err on the side of leaving them a lot, and then when you get more advanced, you'll take some, and sometimes you take too much. It just depends on, it depends on what you're doing. I do this for monetary reasons, so I take as much honey as possible. I leave them enough to survive, but I don't want to leave them extra honey because I'm in the business of selling the honey. So if I make an error and I leave them too much and something happens, they get hive beetles or a raccoon tips it over in the winter, then I've lost money. So I need to find out kind of exactly how much they need. You're never going to get it exact, but you can get it pretty close. So that's another thing to keep in your notes. If you left them, let's say you have one deep chamber and you left them 3 supers full of honey and they only ate 1.5, then you know that you probably could take that extra one, or you might even be able to take, 2 of them, depending on, how you manage your hive. So that's just information to keep track of so that you can better manage your profit and the way you keep your bees. All right, so I think that's about all we're going to talk about with that. If you have any questions, let me know. So how do you keep records? Now that we've gone through, why you should do it and what you should keep records of, how do you do it? Well, I'm going to show you like 3 different ways to do it. And as I've gone through my beekeeping career, I've done all of these. So that's another thing that will happen as you get more hives or get busier, or your life changes. Maybe you get more kids or more grandkids or whatever happens in your life, or you get 5 more jobs and you had one. Something will happen that will change how much time you have, and that's what will change how you'll keep the information for your bees. Because unless you can devote 100% of your time to this, you need to do something that fits within the time that you have. So I would say do something that you will do all the time, and don't make it some big grandiose thing that you'll do one time and then say, oh man, that takes too much time, I'm never going to do that again. Don't do that, because it's important to get the information, even if it's just a few sentences. Or I'll show you some of the stuff that I do, where you just make a few marks, and then at least you have an indication. You'll go back to that 6 months and go, oh, I'm glad I wrote that down. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn out paragraph about your bees. So some of the things that I kept in an early notebook, I had a hive layout. I actually drew squares and I put the numbers of the hives in there. And then I would write under each one what was going on with it. That's kind of how I first started. I had this great, like I just said, a grandiose plan of all this information that I was going to put in there. That was back before I was doing the kettle corn, so I had more time in the summer, and I could go back to that notebook all the way through the summer and write every 2 weeks. When I was checking my hives, I could write information about that. And as time went on, that became very cumbersome, so I moved on to some other things, which I'll talk about. The other thing that you want to keep in your notebook is the plant stuff that we talked about. Keep your bloom dates and all that stuff. Make a separate chart. What I did is I made a line for each thing that bloomed, and I just kind of put it in there. Goldenrod bloomed September 1st. Maple bloomed April 15th, and just go down the line as you put those bloom dates in there. And you can do that on several pages. If you leave yourself 4 pages, that'll be like 4 years. You could do 1 page per year, and then you'll just be able to flip back between those 4 pages and go, oh wow, look, things are changing. It's getting a little warmer, it's getting a little colder, I need to change things a little bit. I need to think about, maybe I should feed my bees more because I don't get, the pollen is moved this year to 2 weeks and they're not going to make it because my bees are just barely making it to February. Whatever those times are, that's the reason you need that information, to make informed decisions about your bees. And so that's kind of what I did. I did hives, plants, and let's see, I know there was something else that's not on my slide here that I put in there. And I don't really remember what it was. Probably the strength and some of the other stuff that we talked about. I put all that information in there. My queens, I had my queens numbered and labeled. So I put all that information in there in a notebook, just handwritten, simple. But I did it in such a way where I could go back to it every year and look at it and compare, how things were going. Also, obviously, the honey. I'd put at the end of the year, I'd put how much honey that I had harvested from that hive, and I might have done it 2 or 3 times. I might have taken a super in the spring, 2 or 3 frames in the summer, and then a full super in the fall. Excuse me, and I would keep track of that through the whole year, so I could say I got 65 pounds from this hive, 30 pounds from this hive died, I didn't get any. So then you can kind of come up with an average of how many pounds of honey you get for your whole thing, see if you're making any money, or if you're losing money, or if you're just having fun. That's kind of how it works. All right, so the next thing that you can do is, well, okay, what happened to my thing here? Sorry, this got discombobulated here. The next thing you can do is keep the actual records right on your beehive. And there are several ways to do it. There's the brick method, which I don't have any pictures of, but it's popularized by, I think there's the Fat Bee Man has a couple videos on it. Joe May from Little Bits of Honey has a video because he learned from the Fat Bee Man. But there's all kinds of ways to like take one single brick and move it in different directions, and that'll tell you something about your hive, whether it went queenless, whether it's small, whether it's going to swarm, all kinds of things you can do with a brick or another piece of brick. And just putting it on the top of your beehive. A lot of people have bricks on the top of their beehive anyway because it holds the top on. And so you could use that brick to indicate to yourself what's going on with that hive. You could also use a notebook with that, but maybe you don't want to do the notebook and you're just going to use the brick. What I tend to do now, I used to use the brick method. Now I use what I call the Michael Palmer method. If you don't know who Michael Palmer is, do some searches on YouTube or on Google. He's a fantastic beekeeper in Vermont. He keeps several thousand hives. He does nukes. He does queens. He does all kinds of cool stuff. I use a lot of his techniques in my beekeeping. And I've learned a lot from watching his videos and reading his posts on one of the bee sites that he used to post on. And I'll show some of those pictures right now. He writes right on the top of his hive, and he just does a little shorthand. So here's two examples of the shorthand. The top one is on a metal, and the bottom one is on wood. And I just use the queen marking marker, whatever that one is for the year, because that seems to hold up for a whole year. I'll be able to read that next spring very easily. It'll hold up to the weather and the rain and the snow and everything else. You can kind of just see the shorthand here. And the reason there's two, I put the date in the middle. You can see how I put the date in the middle. The reason there's two entries, one on either side, is because I keep my bees in two 5-frame nukes all the way up in a tower. So there's actually two hives inside this box, one on the left and one on the right. So on the top one, you can see that on 8/30/18, I put a new queen in here. It says plus BBLQ, which is I bought a Barnyard Bees laying queen, and I put that in there on August 18th, and I direct released it. So I let her sit on the top. They seemed like they were really desperate for a queen. They didn't attack her. I just let her go walk right in, and that was fine. And then on the other side, these bees were dead already. I don't know what happened to them. Doesn't really matter. They were dead. So I just put no bees in there so that I knew I didn't have time to add any more to them or put a split in there, so I just left it. And then the next entry is 2 BEL plus Patty. Let's see, I can't really read that. Oh, bees and stores. So 2 BEL, that's shorthand for 2 frames of brood eggs and larvae. So on the 4th of October, I had 2 frames of brood eggs and larvae. I added a pollen patty, and I had a lot of bees because I have bees check, and I had a lot of stores. So there's 2 supers here, 2 deeps. And so the top one was already full of honey at the end of, or at the beginning of October. So that's kind of what you want. And then again, no bees on the other side because I didn't do anything. And then you can just kind of see I added the patties and the date. And I checked the other things, and I just put check, check. If there was a change, if there would have been less bees, I would have said less bees. If there would have been, if all of a sudden they would have eaten all the honey for some reason, I would have said, well, the stores are light or medium or something like that. But that just gives me an indication. So now when I look at this in the spring, I can go, wow, this thing it was fed well, it had bees, it had stores, and everything was fine. And I did treat these bees, and I did not put that down on the lids because I treated them all the same way. So I didn't do that as a generic thing. I've treated all my bees with oxalic acid fumes, and so I didn't. But if you could say, you know, this one was treated, this one wasn't. This one maybe used a different method on a bigger hive, something like that. You could put that indication here. This one's a little harder to read down here. You can probably read it better than I can because it's bigger. It's smaller on my screen, so I can't really read it. But again, it's a shorthand. You can see there's two sides, and you can see where I added queen on one side. The other one had brood eggs and larvae on the August. So you can see I didn't do any checking of these hives in the spring. So in the spring, I checked them and I wrote them in my little notebook because I had more time. In the fall, I don't have as much time because I'm still working on the kettle corn, so I just write it really quick on the top, and that's all I do. That's all I have time to do, just so I have an indication of where this hive is headed, whether it's swarmed, whether it's making a lot of honey, what's going on with it, so that I know how to take it from the fall through the winter into the spring. I just need an indication of what's going on. That's really all the note taking and stuff is for, so you have an indication of what's going on. So that's the Michael Palmer method. If you want more information, like I said, go look for his videos. He explains it, and you know, you would just use your shorthand. You could use the same thing, but make up things that you understand. Whatever your 2 or 3 letter symbols are, just use that. As long as you can fit it on the top of the hive, then it's going to work for you. As long as you understand it, that's all that matters. Just like your personal shorthand. All right, so here we go. Here's another thing that I used to do when I first started. I used cattle tags. And so here's a cattle tag number 39. And then I had this little red thumbtack in there, and that was a kind of a queen. So, you know, you can get those thumbtacks that are in red, green, blue, white, orange. And so each one of those colors represented a different kind of bee that, you know, bee genetics. And so this one was red 39. It was, I believe it was Carniolan was the red, and it was number 39. So then I would, in my notebook, I would write next to red 39 all the information about it. And so that's kind of how I kept track of all the different boxes. And so that's kind of what you need to have. If you just use a notebook and you don't write on your hives, then you need some way of just differentiating the hives, especially if you had, at that time, I think I had 80 or 90 hives. And so, you know, you have to figure out which ones are which. And so that's how you do it. This little rubber tag here is a cattle tag that they use on the cattle ears, and they actually hold up pretty well. They do dry rot after 2 or 3 years, but they hold up pretty good. And then the one right next to it is called it's a Tivic label. I got those from Uline, the Uline, the big shipping company in the United States. And believe it or not, that tag has been on that hive for 4 years, and it hasn't faded or anything. And that plastic, it's made out of the Tyvek material that they make chemical suits and bee suits out of. It holds up to the weather. All I did was screw it. There was a little grommet here. I screwed it into my hive. I put a number on it. And the nice thing about these tags is they're color coded. So this is a yellow by definition. So if you pick a yellow color to represent all of those bee genetics, you can just put the yellow one on whichever hives those are. Excuse me, and then add a number. So that's kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Then you don't have to have the thumbtack. It can fall off. It can get moved when you're moving the hives, and then you can forget, like, oh gosh, that was number 39, but what genetics was it? So I like these new Tyvek tags. They're pretty good. But I've gone away from these because now I do most of my information on the top of the beehives. I really like that. It's very direct. I've moved my hives to a lot of different places on my property now, so they're not all in one spot. So it's just easy to go to that new yard and look at the top of the hive and see what's going on with it. And then if I want to take some of that information and put it in a notebook at the end of the year, if I have time to kind of culminate it in one spot, then that works also. So whichever way works the best for you. So those are kind of some of the ways to keep track of information right on your beehives, so you don't have to worry about writing it in a notebook. All right, so how do you do it digitally? Since we're in the digital era, maybe you don't want to write it. Maybe you don't want to put it on your hive because you don't want people looking at what's on the top of your hive. Maybe you have beautiful wood hives that you don't want to write on. I've seen some really pretty hives out there that people would probably not want to write on with a marker. So I understand that. If they're works of art, you don't want to write on them. Maybe you want to use digital records. You can use a Google Doc. You can just open a Google Doc and write your hive numbers in there or your hive position and keep some notes some of the information, or your plant cycles. Obviously, you could do that in a Google Doc or a simple spreadsheet or Google Sheets, whatever your favorite brand is. I don't know if Apple has a Sheets program. I'm sure they do. So, whatever you got that you enjoy working with, and it's going to make it easy for you to do this information. That's the key. Do something that you're going to do all the time and be consistent at it, and use that. And then I have down here apps. One of the ones, there's several, but the one I have used and I enjoy using and I still use is called Hive Tracks. And you can get it for your phone and your desktop. And one of the nice things about the phone version is you can do kind of an abbreviated inspection of your beehive and put that information in there. And then that gets uploaded into the full desktop version so that sometime later you can go to your desktop and add more information or look at it. And that little mini inspection that you did gets loaded from your phone. So you could go to a remote bee site with your phone and just take a picture. You can actually do audio. You can do audio, and you can talk into your phone and tell what's going on with an inspection, take some photos. And there's a lot of check boxes where you can say, I'm treating it, I see a disease. There's all these check boxes and information on the Hive Tracks app. And then, like I said, it gets updated. It syncs with the big app, and it's all done on their cloud. None of it is kept on your computer or on your phone, so that if you ever lose your device or your computer crashes, your data is still there. I used Hive Tracks when it first came out. Gosh, I don't know how many years ago that was. And then I didn't use it for 2 years. Then I went back to it. All my data was still there. I just renewed my subscription, and it was all there. One cool thing about Hive Tracks is kind of I don't know, I guess for a big, huge beekeeper that needs to keep track of their inventory of boxes and stuff, it would be good. But it's kind of to me, it's just kind of fun. But you can actually build your hive. You pull in each box, your honey supers, and you build them, graphically. And you can actually then print out a thing that says, I have 2,000 brood boxes, 6,000 frames, all of that, when they actually do an inventory of your equipment, which is kind of cool. But, graphically, it's just kind of cool to build your hives and show that you have 3 honey supers on this one honey super on this one. So for that, you can get a visual, and then you can look at your whole apiary in a graphical form and kind of look at how many, like, oh, this hive doesn't have any honey supers on it. What happened? Did I miss it? Or is that one dead? Or, what's going on with that one? So Hive Tracks is a pretty cool app. Check it out, hivetracks.com. Like I said, I've been using it. I use it off and on, but I do pay for the yearly membership, and I do like it. And a lot of times I'll go back in the winter when I'm not busy and put information. I'll go take a picture of the hive tops, and I'll put that information in there later when I have time, so that, like I said, I have that record to go back from year after year after year, because I do like to look at the stuff year after year and see what's going on with that. All right. So in conclusion, what can we say about beekeeping, record keeping for beekeepers? Well, record keeping equals good stuff. Like I said 3 other times, it's great to look back over the years when you start this hobby and see how you've improved, how many hives you have, what's going on, just total education and how much you've learned about bees. You'll see the difference just in your notes and how much you've learned. It does inform your feeding and your treating and your requeening, and everything that you do to the bees. Your notes will inform you, and they'll help you remember what you did, what you didn't do. Maybe there was something you didn't do. Your bees died. One year you did something else. Wow, they all survived. What was that? You look back in your notes and say, oh yeah, I fed them more because I had more time or had more money or whatever the reason. Things that you do to the bees make a difference. And my final thought is just do it. Just do something, write it down, get it down, put it in your phone, put it on your computer, whatever it is that's easiest for you to do, write it down so that you have information to go back to next year. Or if you're just starting, if you're not a beekeeper yet and you're thinking about starting, when you first start doing bees, get that information down on paper or in a computer or on a phone, because you'll be happy that you can go back to it later and go see where you started and how much you've learned. All right, well, that's about it for today. Please smash the like button.